Okay. Good afternoon. Afternoon? Is it afternoon? It's noon. Good noon. So we were going through like Sefer Bereshis earlier, and we were like looking at like some of the, I guess you can say, like fundamental personality traits in the characters in Sefer Bereshis and how they sort of pass down through the spiritual DNA into the Jewish people, into all of us. But now Sefer Bereshis is over. So we're up to Sefer Shmais. I thought we'll take like a little pause in the Parsha because it is currently Yud Ches Teves, which means that we are not too far off from Shvat. And I thought maybe we could do a little bit of preparation for Yud Shvat, which is coming up in a couple of weeks. So we're going to have this class today, and then actually the next time I'm teaching again is actually going to be Yud Shvat itself, which is on a Wednesday. So Wednesday in a couple of weeks from now. So we'll start today and we'll wrap it up on Yud Shvat. So I thought that could be nice. So just like a little introduction about Yud Shvat, what Yud Shvat is and what we're going to be learning. So Yud Shvat is the day that the previous Chabad Rebbe passed away. The Frierdiker Rebbe, Rabbi Yitzchak, he passed away on Yud Shvat. And then 1 year later, the Rebbe accepted the leadership and he became Rebbe on Yud Shvat. And the way he sort of showed that he accepted the leadership is by saying a mimer. And the mimer that he said was the mimer called Basi. Now, the year before that, on Yud Shvat, the year before when the Frierdiker Rebbe passed away, the Frierdiker Rebbe used to review mimarim that he had said previously, and he would review them and prepare them for like printing so that everyone could learn from them. And they would be just reviewed and edited to make sure they were very specific, etc. And then they would print them. So he prepared this mimer, Basi, a mimer that he had said previously, but he prepared it specifically to be distributed on Yud Shvat, which was the day that he ended up passing away, which was also his grandmother's yahrzeit. Is his grandmother? Mother? No, grandmother. So he prepared this mimer to be distributed on Yud Shvat, which was the day he passed away. And the Rebbe looked at that as if this is like his will, his last will and testament for the next generation, right? Because he prepared it for the next generation. This is the last thing, this is the last message that I'm sort of sending you out with. And over the next 40 years or so, the Rebbe would take one aspect of that mimer and expound on it on Yud Shvat. So we're really looking at this as sort of like the mission statement for our generation of what exactly is our purpose is all seen in this mimer. So what I thought we'll do is that today we'll go over the first chapter of the Frierdiker Rebbe's mimer, which contains a lot of the basic philosophical ideas that are in this mimer. And then next time we'll try to take those ideas and maybe ground them a little and take them and try to draw out what is the Vaida element of these ideas, right? So we have the idea as it exists sort of intellectually and philosophically. And then next week, hopefully not next week, but the next time we do this, we'll try to see more okay, so what does that mean practically in our Vaida? Okay, so today we're going to explore a little bit what is our focus supposed to be right now for people living in this world the Rebbe started talking about this in 1950, but it's still, I think as we learn it, we'll see its relevance very strongly in 2023, right? I think sometimes I'm still saying 2022, but yes, in 2023. Okay, that was a long introduction. But so we'll do some of it inside and talk about some of it outside. So I gave you the first chapter. It's long, so we're not going to do all of it inside, but we'll do some of it inside. Okay, so I'm going to start inside. So the mimer opens up with a pasuk from Shir Hashirim. Shir Hashirim is basically one of the books of Suvim, right? It's a Megillah, and it is written as a love song between a man and a woman, and we know that it represents the relationship between Hashem and the Jewish people, right? So in Shir Shirim, the line says, Basi Lagani, come into my garden, Achesi Kala, my sister, my bride. The Isa b'Medrash Rabbah, and it says in the Medrash Kamkaima over there in Shir Hashirim, Lagan ein ksiv kan ella lagani laginuni. It doesn't say come into my garden. Lagan ein ksiv, it doesn't say come into the garden. It specifies my garden. And then it says laginuni. What does it mean, my garden? Why is it my garden? It's our bridal chamber. There's something private and exclusive about this garden. This is where my essence was originally. So it's saying, come into the garden, my sister, my bride, come into the space where I originally intended to be. Okay? So that's the pasuk that we're sort of basing, or the idea that we're sort of basing this on. So what does this mean? De'ikar shchina b'tachteinim haisa. That the ikar shchina, the main shchina, and we'll talk about what that idea means, was b'tachteinim, was in the lower realms. Ba'al yedei chet etz hadas, and through the sin of the etz hadas, nistalka hashchina, the shchina basically ascended me'eretz l'rakia, from being down here on earth to the heavens. Ba'al yedei chet kayin ve'enesh, nistalka hashchina me'rakia aleph lebez the gimel. And the Shekhinah basically left higher and higher and higher through all these different sins that people did. Okay, so what does this mean? So when we're saying that God created the world, when God created the world, his main attention and focus and intention in creation was for the lowest world, for earth, on earth. So you can have, I think sort of like the best mashal I've thought about for this in my mind is, so let's say you have a business, right? And in your business, like to create your business, you have your entire business plan, right? And the business plan has many different parts to it, and you have many different people working for you, and there's many different layers in the business, right? There's the financial side of the business, then there's maybe the more practical side of the business, how it comes out, et cetera, right? But every business should have its ultimate goal and purpose and function. Like why is it that I'm creating this business? What is my intention in creating this business, and what do I really want to get out of it? Right? Make sense? Right? So like you can have I don't know. I'm like having a hard time like thinking of like specific examples of like a business, but okay, I have an idea. Okay, so you can have there's a very altruistic doctor, and he wants to start a medical practice to help all people, that they should be able to receive medicine or whatever, right? So in order to set that up, you're going to need to have a whole massive system in place, right? You need the doctors, you need the medications, you need the nurses, you need the building. And there's going to be, what sort of ends up being the more difficult side of it, like the administrative side of it, of dealing with insurance and all that other stuff that comes along with it, right? So why did the doctor create the business? Because he wanted to help people. And what often happens, you see, with like altruistic people when they start businesses, or very often when you start something and you have like this vision for it, and you're very like, you have a very specific vision for it, what happens when the practice starts maybe in general moving towards a space where it wants to make more money and less likely helping people out, or like, right? So it starts getting derailed, right? The original vision starts to get derailed, right? So for the person who started it, their entire interest and investment in this business can start to just lessen, right? I started this whole operation because I wanted to help people. And I see that I'm not actually helping people. So I start to become less and less invested in my own business, right? And that can work. It doesn't have to be altruistic. It could be any sort of end goal that you have. When you see that the original intention that you had for whatever big plan you have is not actually working out, you start to lose your interest, because our motivation and our interest is very much tied into our goals, right? So our vision and our goal and like our ultimate goal is very much tied up with our motivation and investment in that thing that we're going to be pursuing. So when Hashem created the world and he had a certain vision for the world, right? And he said, oh, I'm going to create this world and my main light is going to be on earth, and the people on earth are going to be able to recognize me and follow my will while on earth and in a physical world. And then he starts to see that maybe through flaws in the design, which often happen, right? Like Hashem, not to say that God's design is flawed, but like he built a system where there was potential for flaws, right? Where for people to mess up. But so people start messing up. And so with the original sin, with the original sin, it's almost like, oh, wow, this thing's not really working out the way I expected it to work out. So what happens to my interest? Starts getting sucked, it becomes more internal instead of external, right? And it starts leaving earth. And then with each subsequent sort of big act that happens in God's big project, that sort of totally negates his whole purpose in creating it, the interest becomes less and less and less, and is moving higher and higher sort of back within himself instead of being down here on earth. So that's how, that's sort of how I'm understanding this idea of that the main Shekhinah is leaving earth, right? So the Shekhinah is the part of God that is interactive and interested and with the creation. And the less we sort of feed into the motivation and actualize the vision, the less God's interest is in creation, right? So over the course of a few generations, it says Hashem's interest became less and less, and he became less and less invested in the world. Okay, doesn't mean that he wasn't there, but he was less personally like interested and invested in creation. So that was sort of like the negative side. The acharka, and afterwards, amdu shiva tzadikim, there rose up 7 tzadikim. V'haridu es hashchina lamata, and they schlepped God's interest back into down below. Avram zacha v'harid es hashchina merakia zayin levav. Avram drew it down from the 7th heaven to the 6th heaven. V'yitzak mivav lahei ad ki Maisha hu shehu hashvi, until Maisha, who is the 7th. B'chal hashvi and chavivin, and all 7ths are cherished. Haridu lamata ba'aretz, he managed to reground the Shekhinah back here on earth. So we basically have the opposite pull that's happening. So the interest is lessened and God's not so interested. It's not going the way he planned. But then 7 tzaddikim come up, are born, arise, and they do their avodah, and they redirect the energy to come back down on earth, because they sort of redirect the vision, right? And they bring life back into God's plan, because he sees that they are actualizing what he wants to happen. So Hashem then becomes more and more invested. And so we go from the 7th heaven, whatever that means, meaning more internal, more spiritual, Hashem becomes more and more and more invested in the physical world, until we come to Moshe Rabbeinu. And from Moshe Rabbeinu, when we actually receive the Torah, what happened when we receive the Torah? When we receive the Torah, all of a sudden, heaven and earth are no longer separate. They're completely and totally united. Through the power of the Torah, in my physical brain, I can actually capture God himself in my physical brain, right? Because that's what the Torah is. It's God himself placed into wisdom that can then be encapsulated in my brain in a very physical way. Through the Torah, we also receive that when we do a mitzvah, we actually change the physical reality. We can take a physical object and make it holy, right? So that was what we were empowered through the Torah, because Moshe Rabbeinu so strongly sort of cemented God's will into earth that it became, you can say, like inextricably intertwined. Right? Now, heaven and earth, it cannot be anymore that God becomes disinterested. Hashem is ultimately interested in our earth. And so on some level, receiving the Torah was the first step of God's vision being recognized, of his ultimate vision being recognized. Does that make sense? Right? Because he wants to be present on earth. Through receiving the Torah, we now are able to really completely and totally meld heaven and mold. What's the word I'm looking for? I don't know. I feel like I just merge, maybe. Put together. Meld works? Okay, thank you. So meld heaven and earth, and we can totally unite them. But at the same time, we know that we're still working toward the ultimate, right? Because Mashiach is in here. So that means that there is still another level in this unification of heaven and earth, of Hashem making himself comfortable down here on earth, right? And binding us into his bridal chamber where we can actually and actively unite with him. There's still another level that we can reach, because we haven't reached the ultimate yet, proof being that like Mashiach is not here and that we're still working toward a goal, right? So that's sort of the focus that we're going to take in this mimer, is that we're going to look, okay, so how do we connect heaven and earth more and more? How do we express ultimately that this world is God's garden? That's our ultimate goal, is to express that this world is God's garden. So how do we go about that process? So before we go into that, just to like think in our minds, why is our world, or how is our world not Hashem's garden right now? Yeah. We feel separate from him. We look around the world, we see a lot of stuff, right? We don't see Hashem. And it goes so far that like it's still very easy, if someone wants, to deny God, right? That's a very common thing in the world, for people to deny God. And even for ourselves, you know, if you're a religious Jew who, or not even a religious Jew, just someone who believes in God, it's possible for us to say no to him, right? And not to do his will, because it means that the world is not like outwardly expressing itself as a home for Hashem, right? And we still see the barriers. So how do we go about transforming that? How do we change that reality? So we're gonna skip a little bit, and I should have numbered the source sheet. But if you could just bear with me. It's like a little more than halfway down. It says V'ha'inyan hu. It's like 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. It's 11 lines from the bottom. It says V'ha'inyan hu. And what is the idea? What does it mean to turn this world into Hashem's garden? That the main intention in the creation and isifying of the world was that God desired to have a home for himself in the lowest place. That there should be revelation of God even on earth. And how would that happen? That happens through the work of man. And which work specifically, which Avaida specifically accomplishes God's revelation on earth, is al yedei iskafia ve'ishapcha. That is accomplished through the Avaida of withholding and transforming. So how is it that we turn this world into God's garden? How is it that we reveal God here in the lowest realm? It's through the Avaida of man, specifically through Iskafia and Ishapcha. And we'll talk about what that means in a minute. The neshama tered lamata, that the soul travels down below. Leslavish beguf, to be clothed within a body, v'nefesh bahamis, and in an animal consciousness, in a human consciousness, in the animal soul. V'hem ya'alimu v'yastiru al ar neshama, and they block and cover up the light of the soul. Ubechol zeh, but notwithstanding this, like despite this, tifel haneshama birer v'zichel haguf v'nefesh bahamis. The neshama is able to accomplish refining of the body and the animal soul. V'gam chalkai ba'olam, and in addition to refining his body and his animal soul, he's also able to refine his little portion of the earth. Right? So what is our journey? What is our mission? Is that I receive this piece of God, right? Which is my soul, which is absolutely united with Hashem. And it's sent on a journey, right? It's sent on a journey. It's covered up. First layer of coverage is the animal soul, which is just my regular human consciousness that's worried about self-preservation, right? Not evil, just self-focused. Right? And then even around that, we have another coarse layer that hides our soul, which is our body. Our body is like our most external layer of consciousness. If my body is not functioning properly, that's the first thing I feel, right? And it will distract me from everything else. If I'm tired, if I'm hungry, if I'm in pain, if I'm sick, right? That's the first thing that overwhelms everything else, right? So I can really, as long as my body's not functioning properly, it's very, very difficult to tap into the soul, right? And it's almost impossible for me to feel my soul's consciousness because I'm so stuck in the outer layers of my consciousness. And so what is my mission? How am I turning this world into a garden? Is starting with myself. I'm step number one. I need to transform my own self. I'm able to transform my animal consciousness. We've discussed this idea before through translating teaching my animal consciousness about God, translating into very human language to my human self, teaching my human self in a very real way about Hashem, not using, spiritual terms, but in a very human way, communicating the ideas that my godly soul knows with my animal soul. And when I do that process, I basically take my animal soul, which is completely opaque, and I make it a little bit more translucent to what's inside, and it's able to shine out a little bit more, right? And that ends up impacting my body. My whole body awareness can become more in line with God, to the extent that that even my natural desire may start to turn to be a little bit more in line with God's desire. And that's sort of the process. It's very slow, and it's a process of refining the layers of myself. And how we do that is through iskafia and ishapcha. Iskafia, which literally means withholding, is, I think, a big part of iskafia. I don't know, it's such a contentious topic to talk about, withholding. And I think a lot of times we learn it first maybe in high school and then get a very immature relationship with the word. But even if you're learning it when you're older, it's definitely a difficult idea, especially in the 21st century, that, we have to maybe sometimes not give ourselves everything that we want. But I think more than not giving ourselves everything that we want, if we're talking about transforming, I think iskafia is slowing everything down, right? It's slowing down the process of regular everyday living, right? So even if I say, part of iskafia is maybe waiting before I engage in something physical, right? Just waiting a few minutes. And what that does is it just introduces a certain mindfulness into the way that we're interacting with the world. And in that space of mindfulness, I'm able to accomplish transformation, right? I can't accomplish the transformation of myself when I'm just constantly doing without thinking about what I'm doing, right? With iskafia, I'm introducing a pause. And I'm making a mindful choice. And maybe sometimes choosing a certain deprivation of my physical self and realizing that it's not the end of the world. Maybe sometimes not choosing to deprive my physical self and just drawing godliness into that moment, in that pause before I engage with the physical world, right? And setting an intention for that moment, right? That's the action of iskafia, which is the withholding temporarily or entirely. And then we have the process of ishapcha, which is actually transforming. So once you no longer have once that thing that you're engaging with in the physical world no longer has a hold over you, right? And you're no longer in a place where you need to be practicing self-control, right? You've sort of managed to disengage from whatever it is that that it is in this physical world. And we all have the things that challenge us more and challenge us less, right? So with the things that challenge us less, we're then able to come in and transform them, right? Because if it still has a hold over you, it's kind of difficult to go and actually transform it because you don't know which direction will it pull you to it or it to you, right? So if it has the element of control over you, then it becomes more difficult for you to transform it. But once you've managed to like refine yourself enough that this thing, you know, I don't care about it anymore, then I'm able to come in and transform the experience with it and completely turn it over into something that is holy and good, right? So within ourselves, there are parts of ourselves. It's like you have to pick your battles, which parts of yourself you're choosing to engage with, right? Which parts of yourself are you going to just make more mindful and maybe sometimes push things away, and which parts of ourselves we actually want to go deeply into and transform them, right? So let's say if someone is struggling with something, let's say someone's struggling with, I don't know, if someone is, let's say, struggling with certain, you know, negative feelings, even let's just say someone's struggling with certain feelings of like anger towards Hashem, right? Let's say you're just like very like frustrated with everything. So you can choose how you're going to engage with that. Either I can just push that feeling away, which sometimes is going to work, maybe temporarily can work, right? Like, okay, in this moment, I'm going to push this away. I'm going to try to focus on the positive. I'm going to get myself into a more positive mindset and just sort of like put that on the back burner for now, and I'll deal with it later. Or if you feel like you have the space in that moment to go into the feeling, to engage with the feeling and transform it, hopefully, into an energy that you can use. I've always like felt like specifically with like my teenage students, that if there's like anger, and it's so good, it can be so good, because a lot of times I find that they're just kind of like, whatever, who cares, right? So if you're in a state of whatever, who cares, it's very difficult to have any sort of transformation, because what is that whatever, who cares? It's nothing, right? It's just like this, it's this coldness, it's this apathy, you can't work with it. With something like anger, with a feeling, with an emotion, there's a lot of space for us to take those feelings and then channel them productively into something. And it might take some time, and it might take, you know, maybe a few months of some negative actions before you can get to the positive, and before you can transform these into something positive, but it's something to work with, right? So basically we have these, we're given these bodies, these feelings, these self-centered feelings, the self-centered soul, and we're given the godly soul. And the purpose is to start this process of refinement using the tools that we have, right? Start this process of refinement in myself. It happens automatically. As soon as these two come together, the process of refinement starts automatically, because the soul has some sort of relationship with the body. But then it requires some conscious work as we get older, and we start to understand a little bit more about the interactions between the different parts of ourselves, and then we're able to start focusing on refining these elements within ourselves. And then it's not just about refining myself, but then also begam chalkai ba'elam. And there's something about these words that I love. I like them so much. Like, you get to refine your little portion of the earth, right? Everybody gets their little, I guess you could say, your sphere of influence, right? The places that you go It could be very physical, like, oh, where am I physically? Where do I travel a lot? That means I'm in a lot of places physically. And that means that there's a lot of opportunities for me to leave my little bit of influence wherever I am. Or the chalka ba'elam could be the people that you interact with, or even just like the very physical things that you meet up with, right? All these little parts that become your little chelak ba'elam. I think in the very interconnected world that we live in, our spheres of influence can be so much larger. Like we can reach people all over the world. We can reach places all over the world. Unlike, it used to be people really had their little portion of the world, but now like the whole world is so interconnected. So whatever opportunities that we have to achieve this transformation, that is how we're turning this world into God's garden, is through doing our part within, and our avodah within our little space on earth. And that's why it says, we're going to continue after there, V'zahu v'asu li migdash v'shachanti b'seicha. And this is what it means when it says, and you should make me a migdash, make me a home, a migdash, a beis hamikdash, v'shachanti, and I would dwell b'seicham within them. And we all know the famous explanation of the words, and I will dwell within them instead of within it, right? Because naturally you should say, make me a migdash and I will dwell within it. But instead the pasuk says, and I will dwell within them, right? So b'seich kol echad ve'echad, within every single person has the opportunity or the potential to be a home for God. Like we said before, right? How do we become a home for God? By transforming those parts of ourselves to becoming a place where God is comfortable to be, right? Within myself, within the world, that Hashem is just comfortable to be here. This is like we said previously, it's through the work of birurim, of rectification, in the realms of iskafia, withholding, v'eshapcha, and transformation. Kamaimer, as it says, kadiskafia sitra achra, when we push away the sitra achra, istalik yakar dekucha brichu b'chulei almin. We reveal the light of Hashem in all of the worlds. Okay, so now we're sort of getting into the slightly more philosophical part of the Maimer. So the Friedrich Rebbe explains that when we do this, when we push away the Sitra Achra, when we encounter the things that negate God, and we either push them away or we transform them, what do? We introduce a light into this world. Okay? So what do we say? Why can't we see God? Why is it that this world is not a garden for Hashem? Is because there is concealment, right? When we push away the Sitra Achra, when we push away negativity or transform things that hide God, then what are we doing? We're drawing in a light of Hashem. But the Friedrich Rebbe explains that this light that we draw in of God is a light that is much, 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 much higher than any other light that was here previously. Because how did we open up? We started off by saying that where was the Iker Shechina? Where was God's light? Down here. And then he removed it and he reintroduced it, which means that there's a light here, right? But obviously this light is not strong enough for it to be seen by generally speaking, right? We don't see the light of Hashem, right? So when we are doing our Aveda, what we're doing is we're drawing in a new light. And this light is a light that is infinitely greater than the light that was here before. So we're going to explain a little bit what that means. So when Hashem originally created the world, it says that first, when God was creating the world, the world was just all filled with godly light. That's what it says at the beginning of the Rizal.
Could you try again?
It's not talking to you. Okay, so the world is just filled with godly light, right? And it was just Hashem. Hashem was everywhere. And then what did Hashem do? Hashem removed himself to create space for other people, for other creations to exist. In general, just for an other to exist outside of God. Okay? Because Hashem's reality is so real and so true that in the face of something that's so real and so true, nothing else can exist. Easy example to understand this would be in the face of the sun, right? If I was standing next to the sun and I turned on my phone flashlight, would we be able to see the light of my flashlight? No. What would happen to the light of that flashlight? It doesn't have space to exist. Because in the face of something that is so overwhelming and true, light of the sun is like the ultimate true light, right? So in the face of that, something that is much smaller cannot exist, right? It just completely blows it away. It becomes utterly insignificant, right? So if God is as he is, there is no space for anything else, right? Another example that I think also helps clarify it for the next part is, so let's say I'm studying something. Let's say I'm studying, I like to just give the example of, let's say, physics and Albert Einstein, because it's the most like easily recognizable name, right? So I'm studying physics and I took my 12th grade physics and I feel so smart. And I go to, I somehow end up meeting dead Albert Einstein and I start talking to him about physics. In the face, even though physics have come very far and since he's died. So if anyone wants to suggest someone else, that works too. But basically what happens when my knowledge of physics meets up with Albert Einstein? There's nothing for me to tell him, right? It's doesn't exist, right? But let's say Albert Einstein, who was like a little bit antisocial, so he probably didn't want this. But if he was, if he did choose that he wanted to teach me, right? So what does that mean, teaching me? That means he wanted to create a space for my knowledge of physics to exist. That's what teaching me means, right? Like creating a space for me to develop my own knowledge, right? So what would he have to do? He would have to start off by, let's say, teaching me a principle, a very basic small principle, which means he's taking from his vast self and he's zapping most of his information and choosing one very, very, very small idea, right? And he has to give me that one idea. And right? This is the brilliance of a teacher that's actually like teaching a skill, right? Teaching the student something new that they've never had before is all in the silence, right? In that moment of silence, what am I doing? I'm creating a space again for the student to exist. So in that silence, so I'm working through, he shared a principle with me. And now I have like an equation, a problem I'm trying to work through. And I come up to him and I say, you know, Mr. Einstein, Dr. Einstein, I can't figure this out. Is this the right answer? And he looks at me and he says, I don't know, right? And then I have to go back to work and keep on like breaking my head trying to figure it out, right? And then at the end, he can go over it and explain it to me. That's the way that learning works, right? So what happened in this process? He introduced some light, but then also there's the silence. And then in that space, creates a space for another to exist, right? So God, in order to create another, he first created a silence, a void, right? Then he introduces just a little bit of his light back into the void, right? We need to have something to work with, right? So we need something to work with. He introduces a little bit of light back into the void. And then that light combined with the space allows room for others to exist, right? And that is the beginning of creation. And Hashem created a whole bunch of layers and layers and layers of worlds, because as we go deeper into creation, what happens is as Hashem dims that one ray of light that's coming into the universe. I know this is philosophical, but it's important. We're gonna get to the practicality hopefully next time. But God is dimming the power of the light. Okay, until it's so dark that, like we said before, on this earth you could absolutely deny him without a problem, right? Like you could say, oh, God doesn't exist, right? So in the higher worlds, Hashem's light is much brighter. And actually in the world of Atzilus, the creations don't have any sense of independence. It's Hashem's own spheres. They feel utterly united with Hashem. And then we move out of the world of Atzilus into the world of Bria Yetzira. There's also very spiritual creations. They're completely acknowledge God and they're totally subservient to God, but they have some sort of sense of independence. They're angels. They're their own, like, or different other spiritual creatures or souls that have a little bit of a sense of independence from God, but they're still very spiritual and subservient to God. And then when we get all the way to the end of the dimmer, we get to us, right? And like we said, it's pretty dark. We could deny God, right? That's one of the types of light that God used to create the world. The light that we call Mamale Kol Almond. It fills the world. It goes into each creation and into each being commensurate to how that creation can receive it. So if it's a more spiritual creation, it can receive a lot more light and still be. If it's a more physical creation, it can't receive as much light and still be independent, right? The goal on earth is for independence from God. So we're receiving a lot less light on earth than in the higher worlds. Okay, that's one kind of light. But then there's another kind of light. And that is in the idea that Hasidus and the Kabbalah of the Arizal teaches, which is, or at least the Hasidic interpretation of the Kabbalah of the Arizal teaches, that Tzimtzum light kipshutai. When God made the void, it wasn't literal. And his essence is still there in the void, right? So there's a void, there's a space, there's quiet, but God's essence is still in the void. It's not a literal void, right? It looks like a void, it appears like one, but Hashem is actually still there. And that's his essential light. And that essential light is equal in all worlds. In our physical world, it's the same as in the spiritual world. The angels have the same access to it, or lack of access to it, as we do, right? It has nothing to do, put it this way, to the essential light, an ant and an angel are the same thing, right? Only when you start to lower yourself down does there start to be distinguishable, does there start to be noticeable differences between an ant and an angel, because that's only from like the lower perspective. But from the upper perspective, from the essential God, the creation of an angel is absolutely nothing the same way the creation of an ant is, right? Like it's the same. I'm just as far removed from it. It's hard to give an example in human terms, but like if we wanted in human terms, since I'm using the word, since I said the word ant, you can have an ant colony. And you know, in an ant colony, there's a whole hierarchy, right? There's the queen, and there is, I believe, it's not just in bees. Ants also have queens. And there's like a whole hierarchy. There's the worker ants and the schleppers and this and that, right? When I step in an ant, do I care if I'm stepping on the queen or the worker? No, because from my haughty space of being so beyond ants, when it comes to the distinguishing factors between the ants, to the ant hierarchy, it has no impact on me because I'm so much higher than it, right? So similarly, God himself is so much higher than all creations that on a certain level of God, there's no difference between the ant and the angel, or the human and the angel, right? It's all equal. That's a much, much, much higher and deeper level of God. That's accessing God himself, his essential self, right? And it's impossible on a certain level to see God's essential self, right? Because it's too great to be seen. It doesn't have an image. Hashem is beyond all image, right? Hashem is, it's beyond revelations. Essence can't be revealed, right? The essence of even in our own feelings, the essence of our feelings, the deeper something is, the more difficult it is to express it. As soon as I'm expressing it, I'm watering it down. I'm pulling from a more superficial place, right? So how do we express God's essence, right? How do we reveal God's essence on earth? And that is what he says over here is Kadaskatu Sitra Achra. When we push away the Sitra Achra, Istalai Kekare Dekucha Brifu Bechulai Almen. We reveal the light that is in all worlds equally, which means that we're not talking about the Mamale light. We're talking about the higher essential level of light that is revealed when we reveal God's essence, when we accomplish this transformation, when we push away the Sitra Achra through our Avodah. Now the problem is, do we see that? Again, we said we don't see that, right? We don't see that Hashem is revealed. And because the nature of the revelation is such a deep revelation, that it's difficult to see. And that's really what Mashiach is. What Mashiach is pulling away the curtain that lays over all of this revelation that we've created over the course of Galus. The fact that we've in Mashiach, when Mashiach comes, the contradiction will no longer be a contradiction. We'll be able to see the essence, which is by nature unseeable. And we've been basically creating the reality that we'll be able to see it throughout Galus. Throughout our journey of Galus, of working on ourselves and transforming the world, we've been drawing God's essence in a very strong way into our world. And when Mashiach comes, it will sort of be just like the final removal of the veil, and we'll be able to see that. But basically, through our work down here on earth, what we reveal is so much higher than what was originally here. So God put himself here, and he invested himself here, right? And we said that investment of self was, he removes it, he puts it back, right? It's not like his core, right? And through our work, we're able to actually create his ultimate desire, which is to express God's core. Because when we say that Hashem wants to be at home, what is home? Home is that place where you are essentially, right? An example I think that a lot of us relate to is, I think of this like in the context of like sometimes, you have a Shabbos meal with guests, and sometimes you have a Shabbos meal with no guests, either just your family or just yourself even, right? How are you going to act? How is the scene going to look different? It looks different, right? In the scene with guests, the food might be fancier. People might be dressed up. Maybe the kids are on their best behavior, right? But is everyone like ultimately comfortable as they are at home? No, that's the world of revelation. That's the world of Giluyin. That's the world of Almond Light when we have guests. When we're talking about being ultimately at home is when it's just me and my family, right? Or just me in myself in my ultimate state of comfort. I might not look as pretty. It's not a world of revelation, but it's a world of essence, right? And that's what God ultimately wants, is just the world of essence. That's what home is. Home is the freedom of the essential self and the expression of the essential self. And so that's what we're working to accomplish, that through our Avodah, we accomplish that God could be at home. We reveal his essential self. And so what we spoke about today, we actually got through quite a bit of the beginning of this mimer without doing it inside. So I think what we spoke about today, there were some practical elements of it, but a lot of it was, like I said before, like the philosophy behind the action plan, right? So like we said, this is the action plan for our generation and the subsequent mimarim that come out of it, like what exactly are we supposed to be doing? And so in order to understand what we're supposed to be doing, we first have to understand what we're trying to accomplish. Okay, so we have the philosophy behind the action plan, and hopefully next time we'll sort of get into a little bit more practically speaking, how do we accomplish that? Yeah. Right.
And space. And they were both nothing. Right?
From the essence.
From the essence.
Yes.
So I wonder about potential. There's a different potential to the angel as there is to the act. So does that potential impact the beingness or the quality of beingness?
On the level where these distinctions matter, yes. On the essential level, the distinctions don't matter. So on the essential level, you could say that there's a part of God that doesn't care about the world at all, right? Like at the core, like if God needs to care about the world, then